Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good- Um, I, s- I tend to think today's Monday, but um, it's quite a pleasant morning to have all of you here in this 3-day week. And as I was driving here, there were talks about what did people do yesterday on Freedom Day, and some were doing laundry and others were doing this and that. But I'm not going to ask you what you're doing. But it's such a pleasure to have you here, and those who are online, please feel welcome. A special welcome to the Norwegian ambassador to South Africa, who is here without the usual entourage that comes with. So my name is Mano Ramutsindela. I'm the UCT UP Future Africa Research Chair. It's a long title, but I'm also affiliated to the Department of Geography, Geoinformatics, and Meteorology, which is currently headed by Professor Gladman Tonjana. I served there as an extraordinary professor. Initially, when I was appointed, I thought, oh, I'll get a good salary. This title is big. This title is big, but it's a nominal. So colleagues, we're going to have a discussion here on the themes that has been shared with all of you. I thought that it will be useful for us to have more discussions than PowerPoint. So I said to all the speakers, no PowerPoint today. So if they have PowerPoint, they might just delete it. And so we're going to have discussions. All the speakers have been given prompts about what to speak about related to the discussions. So if you could just have 5 minutes, it will be very useful. People who are doing the recording here have advised me that for the audience online to see the speakers, they will need to come to the front. So you will need to speak from the front so that you can be audible to the audience. Having said that, I'm going to ask my co-leads for the core, which is the main organizer of this event, Professor Dan Bennick from the University of Oslo, who we co-chair the core. I represent the core at University of Pretoria, and he holds the European leg of that. So the core, just for everybody's information, is the Africa-Europe connection on research. So ours has chosen, and I can blame Dan for this, the politics of sustainable development. And once you say that, you don't get money, okay? But Dan will give us a briefing of what the core is, what we're trying to do, and so that if you are interested, you also know that we are here to connect with you. I'll also ask Dan to do that and introduce the ambassador, and then I'll come back and do the chair. Thank you, Dan. Okay.
Thank you, Mano. Good morning. First of all, I'm very grateful that you are here around the table. And if you're watching us online, thank you, because if you're on holiday and you think this was a bad week, it is my fault. I did not know. And I made plans without consulting Mano. And so I put him on the spot. So I am deeply grateful, Mano, for you getting these people around the table. But I had two selfish interests. One is, of course, to come back to Pretoria. I have an extraordinary professorship here, and I couldn't come earlier. The other selfish interest is because we have a new ambassador from Norway to Pretoria, and I thought it would be fantastic to introduce her to this wonderful academic environment and in Pretoria as quickly as possible. So I'm a political scientist. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Oslo, where also I'm affiliated with the Center for Global Sustainability. And around 3 years ago, I was appointed to this honorary position in Pretoria. And it was at that time we began to talk about how we could promote more sort of close collaboration between European universities that are part of the so-called Guild Alliance of Universities. This is Oslo, Louvain. You have lots and lots of universities involved in Europe, and the African Research University Alliance, ARUA. So it was under that umbrella that we suggested a cluster of research excellence on the politics of sustainable development. That is what a lot of my team members work on. And this was approved, and we got some seed funding from the University of Pretoria, from the former rector, Professor Tawana Coupe, and from the University of Oslo. And since then, we've been, our activities are threefold. One is we've created a PhD program at Addis Ababa University, where we have 30 PhD students, 3 cohorts, working on sustainable development, governance for sustainable development. We have funding for these students and stipends from the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. So that has been fantastic. We have 3 or 4 postdocs, and we have lots of academics doing research. So that's the, you know, we have the research arm, we have the PhD program, and the third aspect, and this is where you come in, and we've been facilitating these roundtables in Addis, in Malawi, in Kenya, at many of the universities that are part of this alliance with us, to better understand the African perspective on global development. And so without further ado, you know, I'm sure you're a bit aware, the world situation looks very unsettled at the moment. There's a lot of talk about polycrises. I think we need to balance the picture. We should think about opportunities. It's not like all hope is lost. Unfortunately, in a lot of these global discussions that I'm also privileged to attend, some of the African perspectives get lost in translation. And so that is why you see, you know, it is about negotiating, to have that negotiating power to sort of highlight and amplify the African perspectives on energy issues, on sustainability, on governance, how to achieve just transition. So we've been doing these consultations, and one of the things that this is leading to is also sort of policy advice to governments. So as you know, a lot of European governments are cutting down on their aid. I'm not going to put the ambassador here on the spot, but at least our country is still maintaining the 1% GNI in terms of foreign aid, while a lot of our neighbors are cutting down, including the UK, Sweden, etc. But we also have in our country a process where we are consulting our own citizens. What should we do differently about foreign aid? And it is there that I've been making the argument, we can't just consult ourselves, among ourselves. We should also consult with many of the countries that have these views so that we know what we should be focusing on. So without further ado, I wish to welcome and thank Ambassador Christensen for accepting our invitation at very short notice. Very briefly, you can read her, you can Google her, but the thing is that I've had the privilege of knowing her for decades because she attended one of my courses at the University of Oslo. So it is with immense pride I can say that she's a former student of mine, and to see her meteoric rise. Not just as a student, she became the deputy leader of the Centre Party, one of our major political parties in Norway, and then with several political positions, as state secretary, political advisor, etc. She became our Minister for International Development, which she held for 4 years until a year or so ago. So we're very lucky to have an ambassador here who has actually been the minister in charge of development policy, and basically interacting with the World Bank, with the IMF, with the UN institutions, with the African Development Bank, So she is eminently qualified to give us that kind of a perspective on some of these global debates. But to put her experience also in perspective, she was posted, when she joined the diplomatic service, she was posted to Maputo. And she spent 4 years, and she told me last night that she, of course, was offered positions in many other parts of the world, but she wanted to come back to Africa. And so without further ado, Ambassador Christensen, welcome. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Is this okay? Do I fit in the... Wonderful. Thank you for those kind words, Dan. You know, it's as a former student, I feel I'm a little bit anxious. No, I'm not. No. You know, we all have these flashbacks to that fantastic time of our lives when we were students. So, and Dan was a wonderful professor, and he managed to get me through my thesis, yeah. So I'm very grateful to you, Dan. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity to interact with you. I'm looking forward to listening to the conversation, not only because I am a political scientist and I'm genuinely interested in this topic, but also because it's at the core of my task as ambassador, Norwegian ambassador to South Africa, to actually listen to the African take on the current global discussion that we are having. So let me start by thanking you as representatives of African universities, of research networks, for actually putting the discussion of sustainable development from an African perspective at the core of the discussion, because we desperately need it. And we meet at a backdrop that is tragic, I would say. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on that, but we all know what is happening to the discussion on the SDGs, to the multilateral architecture, to the fragmentation of the discussion due to geopolitics. We are at a very, very different place today than just a few years ago. And I'd like to take that starting point, and if you allow me to speak a little bit about my personal experiences from my years as Minister of International Development, because I think it's relevant. I became Minister of International Development in Norway in 2021. It was a very, very different global conversation from what we see today. At that time, we still had good discussions on achieving the SDGs. We were held accountable. You know, we had meetings at UN level, measuring how we were doing, holding each other accountable. That was in 2021. My first international summit as minister was the COP in Glasgow. And I mean, we can say many things about the COPs and the multilateral architecture. It's not perfect, but there was a sense of optimism. There was a real dialogue. And then Russia invaded Ukraine a few months later, early 2022. And from a Western, a European perspective, that changed everything. And just within a few months, I saw how the whole political discussion in the West, on my continent, changed. You mentioned it, Dan, that Norway still provides 1% of GDP for foreign aid, but most of our neighboring countries that I traditionally had a very close and value-based cooperation with changed. The governments changed. There were drastic cuts in international aid from many of what I used to call like-minded countries in Europe. And there was simply no oxygen for real discussions about sustainable development. And another conversation that changed drastically was on global trade. And I'm mentioning this because after decades of discussing free trade, and that was sort of the paradigm. The discussion went from open trade, free trade, to what we called friendshoring and nearshoring. That started with the COVID. We all remember what happened with the global value chains on vaccines. And then with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that had dramatic effects on food prices, on fuel prices, fertilizer prices, especially on the African continent. And in Europe, we saw how there was no appetite, really, to develop those long value chains globally. And that affected Africa bitterly, very, very hard. Are you familiar with friendshoring and nearshoring? Trade, the whole idea was that European countries started to trade with more like-minded countries and countries situated closer to themselves, and that had major effects for African states. And of course, now we see the same thing with the crisis in Hormuz and the war in the Middle East that affects countries on this continent. And this brings me to my points. The discussion on sovereignty. In 2021, the term sovereignty, whether it's food sovereignty or energy sovereignty, you never heard it. It was not a used concept. And I remember it very clearly because my baby when I was a minister was to address food security. And we went from talking about food security to discussing food sovereignty, because, and those are two different things, because food security has no regards as to where the food comes from. So if a country is very dependent on imports of food from another continent, that's a problem when the value chains fall apart. I Googled this concept of sovereignty, energy sovereignty and food sovereignty, and the use of it exploded in 2022 after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because this is also an opportunity for the African continents. There's a new discussion on sovereignty. There's a new understanding also in our part of the world of the need of national sovereignty on food, on energy, on vaccines. And while African states are being asked to pursue ambitious climate pathways, you still have to address all the other needs: energy access, industrialization, food security, jobs, social protection. And at the same time, African countries are underrepresented in the multilateral institutions. So let me use an example from my time as a minister again, because I think it's relevant to your discussion. I was the Norwegian representative in the World Bank and the African Development Bank. And during those years, we had very heavy conversations on lending to projects on fossil fuel in African countries. And there was a big discussion. And many European countries insisted the World Bank and the African Development Bank should not lend money to African countries to develop their fossil resources, for oil and gas, etc., etc. And that was a highly contagious issue, because the African countries would, with a great deal of legitimacy, I must say that these are our resources. You extracted oil and gas. Who are you to come and say that we cannot do it? But however, the Western perspective was, it also is legitimate because we all know that we need to move away from fossil fuel. And not only that, but hopefully, well, I say hopefully, that's a personal view, in a few years' time, the renewable resources will be of such quality and price that it would be a frozen asset to have invested hugely in infrastructure and oil and gas. We would not be doing African countries a favor if we insisted you invest in oil and gas. So, I think both perspectives are legitimate, but it just goes to prove how the discussions on sustainable development it's not a technical issue. It's highly political and politically very, very sensitive, which is why this discussion is so important and very, very interesting for me personally, and it should be of huge interest for all my colleagues from Europe, from the Western Hemisphere, because I believe the world is at a crossroads. We are. We will see major shifts in the coming years, and the African voice needs to be at the core of that discussion. It's not an add-on, it's at the very core of the discussion. And that is nothing less than what you are helping us develop here today. So thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think this has set the stage for our discussions. I just imagine that if we start the debate, we would need the week. But I'm going to, we've swapped the roles. So Dan was supposed to chair this session. And since he has apologized for putting me on the spot to organize this, he said then I can chair it. And so I'm going to ask the three panelists to come to the fore so that we can have a proper recording and people online can see you. I haven't checked whether people online are able to follow us. Can somebody online just respond?
I can hear you properly, Sam.
Okay, they're getting us. Okay, that's fine because we don't see them on the screen. So, okay, so can I ask the three speakers to come to the fore, come to the front, and I know that I've given you 5 minutes, and that's being generous. You will still have more time to speak your mind. As people ask questions, you can sit anywhere. There's no, yeah, yeah. So you, if you could just spend 5 minutes making the critical points that you would like us to discuss. I know it's a very difficult call, 5 minutes, but if you could just try and tell us that you don't believe the world is round, okay? Something like that, and then okay, and then we can have a discussion. Okay, so we're going to proceed in the way that we have lined up on the program, and I think we will start with you. Yeah. No, we start with you. It's on the program. We start with you. So okay, so if you could just briefly introduce yourself, because we didn't have time for introductions to everybody. We might have greeted. Just Colleen, you can just yeah. Thanks.
Can everyone hear me? And is this working so people online? I don't know if it's on. Okay. Thanks very, very, very much. My name's Colleen Vogel. I have been at this university in the past and also at Wits University, and I'm now so-called retired, but I've never worked so hard in my life. But so I was based at the Global Change Institute at Wits, and really it's wonderful to be in the presence of the Norwegian ambassador and all of you as colleagues. I was asked to talk about whose knowledge counts, and apart from giving a long philosophical debate on that, I want to just zero in and perhaps echo what has been said already by the ambassador. So I'm going to look at 3 different scales. Internationally, I've been very privileged in the past to head up some of the African work in the IPCC on several assessments, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I've also worked on IPBES, which is the Biodiversity Assessment. And recently, some of you in the room might have seen the great move now to do an international assessment on poverty, which was foregrounded and I think led by our university, and it was launched on Friday. Regionally, I've also been linked to Arua, but why is this important? I think the international platform is critical, like we've heard from the ambassador, but one of the problems is that we're often not necessarily marginalized, but we tend to be undercapacitated, and I think sometimes we hide our voices. So we're not actually marginalized, we're in the room, but we don't talk because we're not sure that we're really going to say anything powerful. But I think with the turn now in decolonialization, with the turn in feminism, with the turn in Voices Matter, I think that's going to shift, and I'm really grateful for my students who are pushing that. Regionally, the Arua is critical as well, but I worry about where we get positioned in that debate. And so for me, I think it's the time for Africa to lead. I think the ambassador actually said that herself. We really need to start leading now because the climate change window is closing. We don't have time. I'm 68. My son jokes and says, you will be coming to your old age home and you'll be saying, have we solved the problem? She says, Mom, just get a move on. Justify why you use all those carbon miles when you travel internationally. And I could talk for a long time, but those of you who are young in the room, and particularly the young woman, I beg you to read a colleague, she's actually an academic, Farhana Sultana, who is a black academic, asking that we don't always cite the canon of the North. That's not because we're not grateful to the North, but there are debates around development. Who should we be citing? Who should be following? And which canon should we be focusing in on? And she talks about, have you cited a black woman today? Because I think the discourse would be different. And I think the ambassador hinted that there's a turn starting to happen. But locally, and please, if I can have a little bit more than 5 minutes. I did drive in the traffic from Johannesburg, so I think that qualifies. And if you've driven that, you know how bad it is. So anyway, I got here really early, but I'm going to take back some of my minutes. So last week, I was in Madagascar working with climate scientists who are funded by the Norwegians from the Norse group of climate scientists from Bergen. Wonderful meeting. We've got a huge effort going into transdisciplinarity training on early warning systems. I work with the WMO, blah, 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 blah. Lots of stuff. But Madagascar, and here's the point, is the 4th apparently poorest country in the world. And there we were driving into these communities, a wonderful meeting, and I can talk later over lunch if you want all the details. But I constantly was thinking about, as we were talking to communities, as we were trying to, with the best of political will, work with the Red Cross, etc. Hurricanes of the 4th order, 5th order are going to start ravaging that country. But as you sit on the bus and you drive past their housing, it's made of reeds, right? There's nothing. It's a beautiful country. The biodiversity is hugely impressive. But the elephant, and there weren't many elephants, there were, more little chameleons and whatever. The thing in the room is that the structural constraints are what is keeping Madagascar where it is politically. And I don't care how much disaster risk reduction we do, we're just going to keep coming back. We call it in South Africa biscuits and blankets. When the pawpaw hits the fan, lots of people come out, they give biscuits and blankets, but things go back to normal. So I think locally we have to be reading the field much, much more carefully. But I really want to end with a colleague of mine, Professor Karen O'Brien, who I hope the ambassador knows and will meet with regularly. I know her colleague from the university does know her. Karen O'Brien and I are very close friends. We've been working for many, many years. And she's really pushing into a thing called the personal changes that we need to make. So she's done a lot of work, Karen O'Brien, also emeritus professor now and working with other people. But she talks about the personal, the political, and the practical. And I think I don't have time to talk about that, but she really wants us to not only speak on these panels about sustainable development, but also to talk from the personal. And so as I end, I want to try and weave that into my final comments. a researcher by the name of Ritori Chakrabarti. I hope I haven't made his name illegible or not clear. But he wrote a piece, and I think I'm still trying to read up on it again. He says, we cannot sacrifice equity on the altar of integration. I'm going to repeat that. We cannot sacrifice equity on the altar of integration. There's a big push to do transdisciplinarity. There's a big push to bring all the voices in the room. But if we sacrifice that on this notion of integration that is only surface, we're missing the point. So, because I'm so old now in the game, I believe there's an urgency to open that up. So secondly, Karen's plea, and I think the ambassador spoke about this as well, the personal. Where do you sit in this debate personally? Do you still live in the kind of context that is actually not really sustainable? But I'll leave that to you as well. And we need the humanities, the arts, the sciences, the business, the hard and the soft communities in the space. But I want to end with one of the best papers I've ever read, and I implore the ambassador and all of you in the room to read this paper. It's by Maria Kijker, who's from the University of Amsterdam. She works on the politics of water, and water is a big thing in Africa. We can talk about that a lot. But she writes a paper called Do Not Call Me Resilient Again. Do not call me resilient again. And I must be honest, I'm starting to dislike that term quite a lot. And I keep quiet when I have to because I want to come back for Christmas dinner maybe with the Norwegians or whatever. But she says, do not call me, because after Hurricane Katrina, one of the key bureaucrats in that city stood up and said, do not call me resilient again. Do not call us resilient again. We are conditioned to be in this place where we need so-called resilience building. So please don't call me resilient again. Rather change, and here I want to end, change what is making us need your so-called resilience interventions in the first place. And to me, that's the rub of sustainable development. Development for whom? Sustainable for whom? Whose voice is in the room? And do we have the bravery and the courage as Africans, and I'm an African, to actually open our voices and to start pushing back? Thanks very much for the chance to share.
Okay, thank you very much, Colleen. I know you have gone a bit over 5 minutes because you drove early in the morning. That's understandable. Okay, Milupi, you come from very close, so you don't need extra time. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Good morning on this beautiful morning, a day after Freedom Day, and a great sense of appreciation from me actually for this invitation to engage in this very substantive and very profound conversation. Thanks to the ambassador for your presence, and actually Mano and all the colleagues who organized this great event. I need to give you a context. My background, I'm a Mano student of many years ago, completed master's with him on land reform and conservation. And then most importantly, my background work-wise, I was a researcher in the Land Claims Commission. The famous Section 25, we wanted to make it practical to give it practical meaning, I think, as a policy, as a legislation to give dignity to those that have lost land many years ago. I worked for the NGOs on land as well. I worked for the African Wildlife Foundation. We're based in Nairobi, and then in SADC and Eastern West Africa. But my punchline starts as this. I'm putting this conversation using 4 thematic actually pointers. One of the pointers is that we have land restitution in South Africa as a moral, legal obligation for us to actually ensure that there is justice amongst everybody, equally amongst the society. Hence, our approach as a society was that we need to have a balanced and a meaningful land reform across race, across creed, and across different gender divides. The point is that in South Africa, fast forward, there's a story that we are not short of land. We are not short of money to actually make sure that land reform happens. Over the last few years, it has been proven. If one reads, studies the annual reports of the Department of Land Affairs that are often tabled in Parliament, what we are short of practically, it's a just, reliable, and a dynamic way to make it meaningful, which comes closer to the theme of this conference, to say the disconnect of policy the coherence of policy, the incoherence of policy to a greater extent could be one of the impediments. Point one, land restitution or land reform in South Africa is characterized by a great sense of policy incoherence. And that's the angle which I'm saying. It's incoherent because we give land on the left hand and actually we don't actually create opportunities for economic value by ensuring that they've got access to markets, they've got access to skills, they've got access to strategic partnership that actually brings quite a diverse value, both locally, access to markets, also both locally and internationally. Secondly, that it has been in isolation. We have transferred vast tracts of land, and stories that you would hear, people would be saying, but this land reform is not meaningful at all. Why are we not seeing economic value? There's a lot of land that is lying fallow from the rural highlands and lowveld of production of actually subtropical crops like avos and macadamias and everything. People are not actually getting value. But you can't achieve sustainable development. That's my argument. If there's not an understanding, a coherent approach to say, how do we integrate the economics of land into the distribution and transfer of land to these people? And therefore, the ordinary people's experiences are the one which I would like to point that says, but you gave us land, what are we going to do with it? We don't even have access to capital. If the access to capital that we have is state grant, it takes a long time for us to access that capital. We can't use our land for collateral in commercial banks because there's a clause in the transfer of land, in the deed of trust, that says they can't use land as collateral. It is there in the deed, in the settlement agreements when land is transferred. Then how do you use land meaningfully if that be the case? And secondly or thirdly be the fact that how then do you actually, remember that you have got people who own the land who had access to international markets and therefore they leave, that value chain actually access collapses. So you have people sitting on a structured, very high value land asset that cannot actually, even if they produce good quality, having access to those international markets because they're structural barriers. They need to produce quality. It needs to be global gap approved. They don't have access to such kind of technical support. And therefore, that points to one conclusion that I'm putting to you, that there's fragmented institutional responsibilities and policy incoherence that needs to be integrated. I think at a high level, take it further in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Medupi, for those remarks. I think we're going to have lots of discussions on those issues, given how emotive the land issue in this country is. So we move to Professor Gladman Tonjana for your short comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mano. I acknowledge the presence of the Norwegian ambassador to South Africa. I'm based at UP. I'm like 3 weeks old there. I've been at Rhodes University for the last 14 years. So I'm grateful for the welcome here in Pretoria. I was asked to share my thoughts on key challenges to transition to renewable energy, or rather to move away from fossils. And I would like to divide my talk into two, a conceptual basis and a practical basis. The first one, our point, relates to how we actually frame this transition. More often than not, we tend to forget the power dynamics or the political ecology of the just transition to energy. Especially thinking about the key actors in that space and the interests that are served, which often disproportionately affect the marginalized. It's going to be the second part I'm going to speak to. I draw experience from working in transition to solar energy, mainly in the Eastern Cape province, where I've engaged government actors, ESCOM, politicians, and obviously residents. And a key point of interest, and I think it relates to what has been said earlier, the tension between energy security versus energy sovereignty. When we ask residents what matters to them about the transition to energy, is more about energy security, not environmental sustainability. That is a secondary motivation, which points to these tensions, isn't it? To say energy security, should I say, trumps environmental sustainability. And I think that framing needs to reconsider what really matters. It speaks to what has been said by previous speakers. What really counts to the users of renewable energy. So I think that is very important to me. A key point to consider is the role of the state. In the case of South Africa, the state is a key actor, or through not acting really, when it comes to transition to energy, renewable energy. If you think about the monopoly around energy, which of course reduces competition, which is a disincentive for people who would like to invest in renewable energy. This could be tracked down to the funding models in our municipalities, for example. They buy electricity from Eskom, and then they resell that electricity to get revenue. So the moment you think about transition to renewable energy, what comes to the mindset is lost revenue. So you begin to think about what that means for the different actors. So I guess it's quite important to think about the role of the state and the funding model and how that shapes what actually happens in practice. So I think for me, the conceptualization of green energy transition needs to be rethought. Prof. Mark Swelling, who is a leader in that space, talks about the chaotic and haphazard transition to renewable energy, particularly in South Africa, on the basis of these institutional barriers, technical barriers, et cetera, et cetera. I think that is at my heart right now is inequality. I do not think we could speak about this transition to renewable energy without thinking about heterogeneity in South Africa, given that it is one of the most unequal societies in the world. And how do we rethink that so that we do not have this new talk about transition, but the outcomes or the impacts are the same? I'm really worried that the poor and the marginalized could be left out in this debate in terms of conceptualizing it, but also in terms of practical implications on the ground, which we have seen. Recent work, if you look at satellite imagery, in terms of who has access to solar energy, the evidence is clear. If you look at green spaces, the evidence is clear that the poor are always left out. And the president of the country talked about not leaving, or rather taking everyone along, not leaving anyone behind. Unfortunately, if we don't think about whose knowledge counts, who are the actors and interests, I'm afraid it is going to be similar results. So perhaps two take-home messages for me, something that we need to think about is the role of the state and its interests, and to make sure that it is a principal stakeholder and key actor in thinking about energy or transition to renewable energy. And the second point I would like to highlight relates to heterogeneity, especially inequalities, because that disproportionately affects the poor in terms of cognitive abilities, in terms of technical access to technical infrastructure, access to perhaps incentives for the transition to renewable energy. Those things I think are very important for us to rethink, especially in this age where we're thinking about energy sovereignty. How does that work out in practice? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll have to come and join you there so we can have. Need to keep my time. So I really appreciate the important comments that you have made. You've prompted us to to think about the issues that that we need to grapple with. And these interventions are all linked in some ways. But I don't want to take the advantage of being the chair and ask and engage you on these questions. But I'll tell you just one story that I hear often over the radio. Okay, I listen to the radio when I'm driving, so I must just make that clear. Okay. And so there's always this sense that, oh, look how people must appreciate nature, we must, just feed the birds. And I always wonder, how can people who have no food think of feeding the birds? Okay. And these comments, these things trouble me because they are being said by professionals, they are being said by experts. This is how we should be sustainable. This is how we should look after nature. And I really find it very difficult even now to use the concept sustainability at times because of those experiences. But you have given us a food for thought, so I'm going to open the floor for discussions. You can pick up on any point. If there are people online, I might not be able to see you if you want to say something. Claire, can you see them if they want to? Okay, you'll just let me know. I think it will be good for people online to be in the room, okay, if they can just say something there. Any questions, comment? Okay, Dan, you can make.
Should I come there or? I don't need to sit, but I prefer to stand. Thank you for those excellent comments and suggestions, those thoughts, a lot of food for thought. So I just want to get the discussion going. And Professor Vogel, I really liked your point about these buzzwords that are not being operationalized. And in 2010, I wrote a book where I said that, this is just becoming very fashionable. We academics are partly responsible for that because we invent buzzwords that make us a bit famous and they sell our books. And then, 2 years later, we need to invent something new. So I'd very much like you to please reflect on that problem. Is it the problem that we are developing new terms and not operationalizing them, or is the problem that these terms are being developed often with a very global north lens, and that we should be filling these terms with much more of a southern content? So that's the question for you. And the two gentlemen, I'd like to ask you to please reflect on the role of the state, because both of you mentioned, Mr. Shabunga, you mentioned the fact that there's enough land, but often it is lack of capital and other aspects. And you said that the poor do not often have access to the green spaces. So what is it that the state should be doing more? Is it that pro-poor, pro-green policy? Is it, in this sort of a rush to go, transition to renewables, etc., what is it that the state can do to take everyone with them, as the president said? What is it that the state should be doing more of to prevent people from being left behind, whether it is land, green spaces? So the role of the state, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question. I think one of the comments I've heard quite a lot is that we as academics or any leaders in this discourse should get out of our way, because often we stay in our way, and as you said, it's for our own benefits, our CVs, our promotions, whatever. I think a couple of buzzwords that I've tried to get rid of: end users. I work in the climate space. I work with a couple of people who are trying to get forecasts across. I don't think we are end users. We are all users. So a couple of these. Resilience is another one. Chains is another one. I don't think we have horizontal chains. They're not linear. I think they're much, much more messy. So your question is, how can we shift those? Well, I think we need a combined approach. I think we need the North, and we need to be constantly playing in that space, trying to shift that discourse wherever we can. But I do think the South, we need to start, and I need to be respectful here. We are all scholars trying with civic society, with NGOs, to put our voices forward. But I think the biggest problem we have in the South often is that we feel like we've got imposter syndrome all the time. We just got imposter syndrome, and we start off going, no one's going to listen to me. I'm just, I'm just a young graduate student, or I'm just an NGO member, or I'm just a, civic society person. And I think we need to become emboldened. And that's going to take a different kind of training in the universities, et cetera, et cetera. So to answer your question, I do think we know exactly what we're talking about. on land. We've had long experiences, long histories, legacies that we can share, which we have been sharing with various different people, including notable historians and, you know, people who sacrificed their lives for us. But we cannot drop the ball now. We've got access to social media. We've got access to artists. We've got access to bloggers. But our voices need to start getting stronger and stronger with conviction. But the caveat is you need to be speaking truth to power. But what is that truth? And it has to be hinged on good evidence. We cannot just go in kumbaya, kumbaya, kumbaya. I don't think that's going to get us anywhere. So the university counts, but I think we need to stop with our imposter syndrome and hunting in packs. I hate to say that, but we need to hunt in tribes or packs around us.
No, thanks, Prof, for the question. I think what is the role of the state to take people along, as you have made mention that our president often makes reference to that. I think we can all agree that the state actually has got a very bigger role to mediate highly contested relations of power within different classes in society who are contesting for meager resources that are available, which they believe, society believes that they should be distributed to a greater, to deal with the question of justice. So therefore, that if you have a society like South Africa, which is very unequal, which can actually, it's clearly visible even when you drive out. Therefore, you need to have a transition that is actually, the state needs to actually ensure there's a proper integration and a proper policies that are not supposed to actually affect or to hack away at private sector interests, but also to try and strike a reasonable balance to say transition takes years to actually strike a fair balance over a period of time. To give a case in point, that those that receive land in this context, whether it's energy, access to energy, they need to actually be drawn into it visibly and practically, but not only as recipient, but also to a greater extent as those that have got stakes and opportunities for them to participate in such kind of sectors. So the pro-poor policy actually makes an emphasis on what? On trade-offs. Something has to give in. It's a give or take. And it's a space that all of us will live in it, the rich, the poor, and those who have and those who do not have, and those who aspire to have and live a decent life in society. I think conferences and discussions such as this should go to the extent of say, how then do we actually ensure that this policy that we develop and critique, we offer practical solutions for it to actually be applied in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the state has a bigger role to play, and I can see the tensions that it has, one, to advance, the needs of the poor, but also to cultivate a conducive environment for private actors to find it profitable to be in that space. So there are tensions. But what I've seen, working in some spaces, I've worked in, conservation areas, core management, when the agency and the capacity of the marginalized is supported, they tend to have the voice or their voice count in those spaces. So I do think that the state has to be very intentional in promoting capacity building, but of course acknowledging that the state cannot do it alone. There are specialists in this space who should be given the chance to lead in some spaces, and I think that's how balance could be struck. And I think the regulatory environment is quite an important space, because we're talking about capital power in that space, and capital is bargaining power. And I think I'll pose a question. I won't have an answer to say, is it possible to conceive of the transition to sustainable energy or renewable energy if capital has a big role to play in that space? I have no answer, but I think that's important to think about. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for this round of discussions. So I think we have got two options here. We have got, let me see how much, we have got 24 minutes. You can sit in here, or you can go back. But maybe for equality, we should all sit there, so that and the camera will, people are happy for us to go back there. I just realized we have got more time and I didn't take my coffee this morning. So we can sit down and have some discussion. But as we're sitting down, I want to invite colleagues here to start following up on these questions. So before we ask new questions, let's follow up on these ones. Gladman asked an important question: if the power is in capital, what do you even expect from the state? and so maybe let's follow on these questions, and then we can ask new ones. Okay, there's a hand. Emmanuel? Sule, sorry. Sule?
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to make a follow-up question, really, on key points that have been discussed. I think the question I'm talking about is really a good question that Professor Vod raised about the limits and the unnecessary use of terms that actually continue to marginalize and actually exert more pressure to the groups that are already suffering from our own approaches like resilience. So let me just raise a very tangible example from my students. I'm teaching environmental policy to undergrad students. And one student asked me, Prof, aren't there limitations to what we can adapt to? And I completely agree. Let's take the heat stress. I think all the scientific results are out there that people cannot cope with temperature above 40 or up to 50s, and we die because of heat strokes. And that is happening now in northern parts of the world, in Europe. For the past 3 years, I've been spending my Junes in Cologne, Germany, and I see vividly that I can't breathe. And there's no ACs because even in Europe, they haven't coped with increasing heat. So I think we have to be very frank when we discuss these issues of climate change, sustainability, that every term that we try to cope to that are sometimes more capitalistic, market-driven, they have limitations and we have to say those limitations. And one example is definitely how much could community continue to be resilient with increasing droughts, floods, like those happening in Mozambique. Every year we see that. What action do we take? But we also need to understand the contestations and the confusions that also come with our comfort, business as usual. Let's take the example of coal. We definitely know to have energy independency, and we cannot rely on external resources because those supply can be cut off, as it just happened recently with the Strait of Hormuz, that we can't get our oil now. But we need to understand that even some of these are harming our own population, and there are alternatives. So these are the real debates, and I'm so glad that Mano, you're bringing these expertise to put this discussion, to raise the voices of the scholars and the normal citizens. And I think we have a space. So because I will be talking next, I just wanted to flag this so that we can continue the discussion. Thank you. Over to you, Mano.
Your thoughts on this. So shall we perhaps continue some of the, reflect on some of these comments that have just been made? I mean, the role of the state is quite critical. But if things don't happen, what do we do? There are those who say, just get rid of the state. But then how do you govern society? We've got an international system that recognizes states, nation states, and so there's just so many things at stake. Any thoughts on? I want to come back to the African voices, Sule was in a conversation that we had in Dar es Salaam last month on African Voices, which was very fruitful. But I want to repeat that that discussion. But Colleen, you said, you know, sometimes we doubt ourselves whether we can say something, and some people think, well, that's a Commonwealth attitude. So, you know, we're always bowing down and to their majesty, and we're humble, and, you know, and so forth. And others think, well, it's just being African culture, you know, people are not assertive and this and that, and so there are different explanations to that. But for academics and for activists, why don't they say something? Maybe what has happened to us that we can't say? We can't call things by names. Even those that irritate us, we can't say that this irritates us.
Exactly.
And this comes back to the ambassador's point that when there are discussions at different levels, those voices are missing.
Correct.
And so people are self-censored, even when they are not being harassed. You know, is it a legacy? I mean, is it a legacy of people being silenced for too long, that even when they're supposed to be free, they remain silent? I'm thinking of psychological perspectives on this. So we need to, I think we need to grapple with this question, because otherwise even the next generation will not do anything. Any thoughts on that? I thought it was provocative, Colin.
So I'll just talk very briefly. I don't think, do you need me to talk in this? I don't think, is it working? Oh, okay. I mean, you know, we've had Greta Thunberg and the youth are ready, right? They're moving. So I do a lot of work with the youth. And I think the voices, if we don't somehow give that opportunity to the voices. So I think what we tend to do is we silo everything. So we have, you know, commissions on this, and it's normally policymakers. Then we meet the practice community. We meet the practitioner community. We have business. Everyone is separated out. And so to answer your question, if you look at the previous heroes in South Africa, the Mandelas, the, you know, Tutus, they spoke their truth to power, and even at huge risk, as we know. I think the youth are ready to do that, but I think we need to start, and someone mentioned it, new architectures, new entry points, and that's why we've got Future Earth, right, based, Future Africa, based here. We're trying to teach the next generation differently. So I don't want to punt too much Karen O'Brien, but she is a very close friend of mine. She's written a book called You Matter More Than You Think. And she's worked with social quantum theory. She's worked with artists from Norway. And I think it has to start with us, that we do matter more than we think. But I need to be honest with you. I made a joke here the other day. I was invited to a Senate meeting here at Tux, but I was on Senate at Wits. I never spoke at Wits. I was always petrified. Well, not necessarily petrified, but I thought, gosh, I need to go now. They're babbling on for so long. If I start introducing another topic, we'll be here until 9 o'clock. So I used to just keep quiet for brevity's sake. But when I came here to Pretoria, I said, I've got a chance now, because I actually, honestly, we don't have time. And quite frankly, I don't really care. We have to move. So I said to them, I said, I'm just going to let it all hang loose. So I did. Yeah, shame. The poor Pretoria Senate, they had to hear my rantings. But to close the circle and not dominate too much, I'd love to hear from the younger scholars in the room, the younger women. We've got the youth. We've got the opportunity. We've got the science. Our scientists are the best in the world. We punch, I'm sure the ambassador can relate to this, and colleagues from Oslo, and all of us here, we punch way above our weight in these international things. But we're not thinking of the next generation. And so to answer your question, I think the older generation, including myself, we need to get out of our way and service more and help the younger generation. Take the cudgel now, take the baton and keep running. But it's not going to be on the same way the universities always used to work. It's got to change. It's got to shift. We can't be, you know, I'd love to be in an Oxford-based cloister smoking whatever I'm smoking and debating the Marxian dichotomy on wada. But no, when I come home, we've got to move. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but I think we as older scientists and politicians and whoever need to be doing that, enabling that my colleague about land spoke about. You know, if you've got a farm and you've got a piece of land and you don't have the resources to do anything with it, I mean, what's the point? So the business community should be coming in. But I'm so glad the funders are here, because honestly, after last week in Madagascar, some people are funding the same village community in the same places in Malawi. That is, honestly, they must be sitting there, the locals, going, these scientists, they don't really know what they're doing, right? Because they keep coming asking the same community the same questions. So anyway, I could rabbit on, but
Okay,
I'll
no,
promise to keep quiet.
no, thanks very much for that. No, I just think that's very important. And I remember, Dan always say we should amplify the African voice. Okay, I mean, and that's something that he has said repeatedly. So it is something in his heart. I get that. But what is constraining? What is constraining us to have that voice? I mean, the youth can, they've got their own agency. I mean, we have seen this in this country with the fees must fall, the roads must fall.
Is just one?
They changed. I'll come back to you just now, Samantha. They changed the higher education landscape that the Vice Chancellor had been struggling with for years. And they did that within the quickest time possible. Of course, with some distractions and this and that. But the university leaders agreed that the youth helped them to achieve what they've struggled with for years. So there is some agency there. Maybe what the professors are doing, the older professors are doing, is to constrain this agency and not let it loose, because we always say, well, there will be loose cannons and we want to guide them and so forth. And so I'm just thinking about this agency because that's important if we are to engage the world. Samantha, and then I will come to Sam. Samantha?
Hello and good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please proceed.
Okay, great. Thank you so much and good morning, everyone. Thank you for this very timely and relevant topic and discussion that we're having today. I'm calling in from Zimbabwe in Harare, and I've been listening and I had a question more on the just energy transition around sustainability or sustainable development. Especially within the African context where we are energy scarce, where energy scarcity persists. Oh, my apologies for my video being off. Unfortunately, I can't switch it on at the moment. But in spaces or contexts where energy scarcity persists and millions remain in this energy scarce environment, where some have even rely on off-grid options or alternative energies such as solar generators, etc. In a lot of African countries, this persists. How can just energy transition in Africa be truly just if it prioritizes decarbonization over energy access and industrialization? Truly, for African countries that need to industrialize in order for development to grow to an extent that African communities or the young people that you've spoken about have employment opportunities within these industries, such as those that were there in Europe or have been achieved in the European context. I lived in Switzerland and I've seen what industrialization can do for a country at the scale that the European continent, for example, has developed. And I believe, and I'm sure some studies have shown that industrialization for Africa to be at that level, or to at least achieve something at that level, energy has to be consistent. We need a consistent energy supply to supply our industries. And so I think my question then moves to, why is there limited emphasis on achieving energy sovereignty sovereignties for African countries through options like nuclear. Why haven't we considered nuclear energy when some European countries rely on nuclear energy for their industrial processes? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Jessica is going to speak on the just transition in the next session, and energy sovereignty, which is what Sule will speak about. But we can have some preliminary thoughts on this. Jessica and Sule, if you want to, just respond to that remark by Samantha.
Thanks, Manu. I think, Samantha, you raise a very important point. I am in Tanzania, and I can attest that many, including my rural home, we don't definitely have electricity from the national grid, and we depend on solar. So there is no one answer to whether we just go for nuclear, coal. We do have coal in Tanzania, by the way, or hydro. 80% of our electricity is hydro-based, and we just built the largest dam. It's called Nyerere Dam. It used to be Stigler's Gorge. That's the German hunter, his name after Selous, but we got into those colonial names. So the point here is every content is different, or context. Let me give you an example. Kenya is a global leader in geothermal-based electrification of their country. Ethiopia very thoughtfully, courageously build and finance their dam, and they are energy sufficient. So you can't impose, for example, nuclear to Ethiopia because it doesn't fit their context. So definitely every country needs to look back, and everyone should not be told what to opt for. That, of course, is the first option. But then every country has to look back at what cost. If you rely on coal and you have wind that are limitless, and you have solar that could meet, every country really need to look back. And I think there's really good scholarship from Ethiopia's scholars like Mulugeta, who look at how countries can prioritize low carbon development pathways, looking back into their context. So this is where the critical scholarship, expertise of each African countries really matter. And I want to quote one of the reflections that Olukushi Adebayo made in Johannesburg back in 2013, and I was there. The problem with African countries is that we rely too much on external consultants so that our policies get confused, and we don't really have sufficient local content to inform our policy choices when it comes to matters that really works for our content. So why African countries today could not harvest the Inga Falls or in Congo, which it could actually supply sufficient energy for many countries. Why it takes ages for East African countries and those in Horn of Africa could sign deals that could allow energy transmissions. When Ethiopia has supply, excessive supply, they could sell to Kenya, could sell to Tanzania. So we need to look at this. You don't need a consultant to come from elsewhere to tell you how you can use these resources. It really goes back into active citizenship. And I have said this in a session that Manu and I had at the University of Dar es Salaam. African leaders, African scholars need to speak this truth. You cannot develop nation where your citizens cannot speak their minds, demand their rights, act on their responsibilities, and take to account office bearers. You can't move an inch. And I gave in Tanzania an example. If you are implementing a water project and an energy project in rural areas, and those people see it is okay for those responsible to implement those projects to steal the project money, and then the Auditor General comes and say, half of that money was eaten and nobody is taken into account, that becomes a norm. that everyone now think that stealing public money and become rich is a norm. No, you won't go anywhere. So I really like the theme that really talk about sovereignty, just transition, and also citizens' views. This is how countries develop because everyone demand that I need an energy and I need you to finance it with my tax because that's not a charity. It is your tax that is well spent to save your life now and for future generation. That is all about sustainable development. So I think it's the time really we really use the intellectual capacity that we have now in this room, in other spaces, to go back to the basics that we have lost. And this goes back to the major things that South African universities have really started way back in 2014, 16, when I was in South Africa. It's not about just decolonizing education system. It's about liberating the education system because liberation is a continuous effort where students become the active citizens. I think I need to stop there. I see your hand, Mano. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, so I think Prof. Sule touched in many points that interlink, and that's why it's so complicated to talk about just energy transition or just the energy transition. But just on the point, just to bring the point of the nuclear, yes, we have what, one of the highest rates of energy access, if you want to call it, in the African continent, talking in South Africa itself, but people can't afford it. So the grid is not expanding, even though we need to expand the grid. And then when we look back to nuclear, I'm one of the first advocates for nuclear. It's safe, in inverted commas, is good as a base load, which we don't have that when we talk about solar or wind. We don't have the battery capacities at the moment to carry on solar and wind as base load. But then you add the extra layer that Prof. Sule mentioned is the corruption in Africa, the corruption in South Africa. I mean, when I was doing my master's thesis in 2015, I spoke about Kusile and Medupe. And Kusile and Medupe, which are our newest coal power plants, are not finished yet, like they're not fully on the grid. Then you want to add nuclear into the equation, that at least to finish a big nuclear power plant, you're talking about a 10-year project. If we had started that when we started Kusile and Medupe, we probably had 2 nuclear power plants, or maybe half, because you add the corruption into it. So I just wanted to highlight that complexity of this just energy transition, that is not only the policy sovereignty, is highly politicized, is controlled by the government, and then in the African context, you add the corruption side that unfortunately brings delays. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, as an economist, I always see it as it causes life. Like, how many lives are not being able to progress because this corruption hinders from education to our transition, etc. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So Sam has got, Sam is going to come on now, and that will be the last comment, and we pause. So as Jessica was talking about corruption, in my mind, so many cases came back, including the connections with the French and this and that. So I think it has got a bigger circle. Especially when there's big money. And I think in terms of understanding African situations, it might help us also to place Africa within the global context, because that's some of the things that we see on the ground are actually happening in very, very big spaces that we need to pay attention to. So I can only thank my geography teachers for helping me to always think about the world at a global scale, and so that's important. But of course, when we see it on the ground, we need to engage with it. There's also a need to understand the bigger picture of that, and how when we had state capture in this country, it was really a big thing, but then you you link up all the other things that enable it to happen. It's so many players positioned in different spaces globally that allows this to happen. And I think that will be very useful in thinking about the questions of negotiating. Who do we negotiate with in solving the problems that we have? Okay, Sam, you have the last comment to make? Oh, sorry, there's somebody here. Okay. Do you want to add here before we go to Sam? Yes, yes, please. Yeah, yes, yes.
I'm sorry, I don't want to stand in between you and your tea and coffee, but I just wanted to say on the point that Professor Vogel made about including students. So I am a PhD in the Department of Economics and for the Saatchi Chair in Just Energy Transition. I am the research assistant. And the other day we attended the Saneti conference, energy conference, and great talks by the Minister and Deputy Minister of Electricity and Energy. And at the end of their talks, they said, we're doing something that we've never done before, we're listening. And I thought, great, thank you. There's people that have been doing this for years and years and years, please listen to them. And after their talk, they walked out, and we sat there, and we listened, and they didn't listen. And obviously this is happening at, the higher levels of political leaders, but it's happening at a university level as well, where we have people that come in, they give these great talks, they give this motivation, we're listening to students, we're bringing them in, and then students sit there and they're talking to other students. So yeah, and maybe I'm just preaching to the wrong choir, yeah, because maybe you are the converted ones here, but to maybe offer some perspective on this, because what has allowed me, my bosses have allowed me to do, is walk into a room and, this energy landscape is changing so fast, so rapidly. And the research I did last year may not even be relevant this year anymore. But now I can walk into a room and I can engage with all of these topics because they have taught me how to think dynamically and in a multidisciplinary way. And I think that relates also to how universities are supposed to teach on these things. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
To have student voices, and so, and this is the purpose of the dialogue like this, because the classroom setting actually is a wrong one. I'm sorry to say that. The classroom setting, has got this tradition of saying somebody must talk, somebody must listen, somebody must take notes, and one just needs to. Well, I don't want to spend time on this, but if we think of the model of teaching that we have adopted and normalized, it's actually a wrong one. Now, we can talk over tea about this, and because I've spent much of my time teaching, and when I stopped using the model that was used when I was a student, my student, and I remember this comment on the evaluation, student says, Manu must teach. Because I know and I must tell them. And so that's a wrong model. And I'm glad that you have raised that point, because we need to teach differently. It comes back to the voice. Students don't have the voices in class because the professor knows everything. Okay, and the professor could quote the book students haven't read. I mean, in the past, the professor will come with a briefcase, and the students wouldn't know which books are in the briefcase. Okay, to save time, Sam, you can make your comment, and we can discuss about the classroom situation over tea. Sam.
All right, thank you. I'm so sorry you can't see my video. Also, I was actually quite disappointed when I saw that there is lunch to this meeting. I would have made my way to Pretoria if I saw the program earlier. But I just need a little bit of clarity on how customary communal and land and informal land tenure systems in Africa intersect with large-scale renewable energy projects, and what land reform approaches are needed in order to protect community rights, and this one specifically for the people without, especially for the ones without access to the green spaces when enabling investments. Like how Mr. Emmanuel said that it's not charity, but it's investment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Sam, anybody who wants to respond to that? Anybody who wants to respond? It's a general question. Sorry, Sam, could you repeat the question? Because I think you explained a bit and then the question was a bit lost at the end. Sam, could you repeat the question?
Oh, okay. So I needed a bit of clarity on how customary communal and informal land tenure systems in Africa intersect with large-scale renewable energy projects, and what land reform approaches are needed to protect community rights, and most especially the rights of the ones that do not have the access to the green spaces I caught while enabling investments.
Well, now we got the question. Redmond, you want to tackle that?
I can.
That's a good question. I can draw on some experience from Zimbabwe. You'd remember that I think in 2012, 13, there was an energy crisis. And at that point, there was what they call after the land reform program, where land was taken away from commercial farmers to black farmers. But at that point, land was actually taken away from black farmers who were insecure to create space for sugarcane production. And this is where private actors came into play with the financial power and bargaining power, and local communities obviously have got a ubiquitous resource in terms of labor provision and without negotiating power. And you could see those tensions where land is actually taken away from the marginalized. So again, I think the issue of energy, because at that point, the country would frame taking of that land as consistent with energy sovereignty and energy security, because that was a time when energy was very scarce. So I think that without thinking carefully about protection of the rights of the marginalized, this transition could make things worse for communities who are marginalized in some context. And of course, in the case of Zim, you would also need to understand this dynamic within the broader governance space, political space, and what have you, where citizens, in my view, really do not have a say in what actually happens. We're talking about the voice. So I think we need to be very careful in thinking about this transition so that we don't perpetuate marginality in the name of energy sovereignty, especially when private actors are playing a big role in that space. So that will be my 2 cents.
Thanks. Thanks for the question, and thanks for an opportunity to try and respond to this. In South Africa, let me give a case in point. We have historically and currently what we call a dual land system, land tenure system, where you have formal and informal land rights, predominantly in your customer or your communal areas. How this matter was being dealt with, if you can look now in South Africa and rural villages, there's an upsurge of investment by private sector. They are moving into the rural areas. I coin that as the last frontier of economic development, where land is almost free. Because here in the metropolis, I mean, a square inch of land is quite determined by high value market prices. But there's a threat to it. Now we are seeing the connection or the relationship between tribal authorities and private capital penetrate in rural areas. Where's the critical risk factor? The critical risk factor is that these institutions of traditional authorities, to a greater extent, are being contested for not being accountable, for not being democratic in decision making, and even their books are not being audited. Where is this money going? So now the threat is at this level. It goes back to the discussions that we had then to say, what would be the role of the state? The state in this instance in South Africa passed an interim procedures, interim protection of informal land rights, because we did not formalize the rights. There was contestation around giving individual title to these households and communities. Well, tribal authorities, my argument would be, they found it a weakening. The state is trying to weaken their control over the access and use of land, because that's the only veritable instrument of power in their hands. Where capital comes, they've got a bargaining power because they've got the resource. Now the issue is then, if the state, answering the question, if what needs to be done actually to ensure that communal tenure rights are actually protected, we also need to protect ourselves from ourselves because of the elite capture of benefits within the very same group of beneficiaries who are supposed to actually receive these benefits. So it's dual, but also there's a question of accountability. Who's guarding these guards who are guarding us? Thank you.
I think we need to pause and think on these issues as we continue in the next session. There are really many questions. Well, the good thing is that we are recording this, and so we will be able to, put them together again for further engagement. So when I was talking about the classroom model that's wrong, it's that has permeated the conferencing. Okay, so this conference is about this, the next one is about that, something else, but there's no continuity. There's no continuous engagement with the same thing. So we're going to take a break now. Sorry, come again? Somebody online? Okay, Karen online? How many more online? Sorry, just one, okay. Yes, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes,
Go on,
sorry, I
Karen.
know that the line is on time. I just wanted to comment on the point that we mentioned about the choice of people not to speak. I feel that perhaps it's a part of our culture not to speak much, but for academics, I feel that silence is not common. And the reason many choose not to speak, I feel that is the same reason they should. Our lives, our families, and as voices continue to be silenced. I'm from Mozambique. And in Mozambique, for example, just to give you one example, a journalist that documented the exploitation of gas and rubies often face intimidation and violence, and even they can die because of that. And their work reveals how billions are extracted while local communities remain in poverty. This is a stark example of why sovereignty and just transition must prioritize local voices and protect those who dare to speak truth to power. But this must be done very carefully because the price is very, very high. And it doesn't mean that action should cease. It may mean that strategies must change, perhaps by engaging in conversation within our own circles. We can begin to plant thirst for justice, so that people that one day will hold decision-making power, for example, they learn to say no to this injustice, because the point, therefore, is not only about speaking out, but about what each of us are already doing in the face of sustainable development. I do not claim to have the answers, but I wonder, based on your experience, for example, what approaches you would suggest to ensure that speaking out doesn't come out at this higher cost of survival. Yes, thank you.
you very much. That's well put. It goes back to why we have got silences, because if you have seen people whose heads have been crushed because they said something, or they've been they disappeared, okay, because they spoke something, they said something that has ruffled the feathers. Why would you want to speak? Okay. So one of the strategies that activists are using now is forming alliances, so that you have got a group of people who you work with. Let me just use a simple example. We all know Bishop Tutu. And one of the strengths he has was that he was speaking as an individual, but within a group of people who were really behind him. Okay, being in the church that is broader than just a village or a country, it meant that there are people behind, and so if you want to take him down, that there are so many other people who will take his place. Okay, and so maybe that might appear to be a far-fetched example, but the point is that forming alliances is one of the best strategies that people are using these days, so that your voice is protected by a group of people who are working with you. And the same happens with governments, with states. They've got, why do we have NATO, okay? Why do you, so you need alliances, okay? You need to, and this is what becomes important. The intellectuals on this continent were able to forge for liberation struggles because they formed very strong alliances. What was happening in Mozambique was connected to what was happening in South Africa. What was happening in South Africa was connected to what was happening in Namibia. So you had the whole connections, Angola and so forth, Cuba, and some of these relationships are still troubling. Russia, why the Russians are still around, because they were part of the networks. Okay, so I think what we need to do, as the point that has just been made, is to think strategically about how not to expose individuals who have got ideas, but to build on those ideas so that it becomes an idea of the masses, an idea of many people. So it's not only one person whose voice could be shut, but this is what people are talking about as a group. And that is a source of power. Of course, there are many other strategies that the social movements have taught us over the years on how to. Okay, having said that, yes, you wanted to jump in. Okay, you can add a little. Sorry, you can add a little. Anybody else who want to add? Shall we just first have coffee? And then we can. Sorry, I think I made these sections longer, but I thought maybe there won't be many people. So.
Yeah. Sorry, colleagues. My name is Nomzamo Malindisa, and I'm a young researcher. And I just wanted to add on the reasons why we tend not to speak up. I think another one of the reasons is because we tend to speak a lot, but very little is being done. We have a lot of conversations, conferences, seminars, all of these discussions, and we sit down, we have these amazing conversations, we come up with these amazing ideas, but none of them are ever translated. Well, not none, but most of them are never translated into actionable and operational activities and things that we can actually say, from that particular conference that I went to, this is what came out of, that discussion or that conversation. And so I think that's part of the reason why there is maybe a frustration, especially for younger people, to say, yeah, we can speak, like my colleague was saying, you know, they were speaking amongst themselves, which means whatever they spoke about was just ideas that were shared amongst themselves, but were not heard by the people that could actually implement those and operationalize those ideas. And so I think that's part of the reason why we have this frustration with speaking up in some of these platforms, because we are an action-oriented generation. We would rather prefer going to the street and protesting, as we did with Fees Must Fall, to see action, because that's what we are most concerned with. We want to see results and we want to see action from the things that we speak about. Thank you.
Very important to, yeah. So we've got, yeah, now somebody told me that there are 3 types of people. There are the runners, you know, they don't want to think, they just run and do things. And so these are the, and the sage, people who's thinking a lot and not doing much. Okay. I can't remember the other category, but so I think we need all of this. Okay, we need all of this, and I've been privileged to have students who were right in the Feast Must Fall movement, and they will text me and say, you know, bring us some food. and so understanding what they were doing, but they never understood what we were thinking. And until we had conversations. So I think it's intergenerational, and this is what we're trying to build here at Future Africa, an intergenerational dialogue, intergenerational discussions that are also curated, okay? So that's why, you know, once we record this, we have to summarize these points so that next time we meet, we don't start from scratch. We say, you know, what are these ideas? The ultimate goal is to then have a framework. If we say we want, you know, there is injustice in the world, which it is there, what will justice look like in the township, in the village? What are the frameworks? And that becomes the responsibility of the scholars. So and we are moving away, we're trying to move away from the idea of just talking and talking, but curating those ideas and trying to see how to take them into action. Okay, it seems like people don't want to have tea or coffee, but I would insist that we go for coffee now. I know you wanted to speak, but you will be the first to speak when we return. Okay, all right. So shall we break for coffee? Thank all the speakers. Thank you very much.